r/NoSleep. I should have never played at the Centennial Celebration. It started with an announcement during homeroom. Principal Carter stood at the podium, beaming with pride. This year marks the 100th anniversary of our town, and the mayor has chosen our school band to perform at the Centennial Celebration, she said. The room erupted into applause, but I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The Centennial was a big deal, but there were always strange stories about it. People whispered about how the town's founder, Elias Crowell, had made some sort of dark deal to ensure its prosperity. Stories of shadows, voices in the woods, and people going missing on the anniversary all seemed like old legends, but I couldn't shake them. In band practice, Mr. Collins handed out sheet music titled The Centennial March. The melody was beautiful but unsettling, notes seemed to clash, creating a dissonance that lingered even after the sound faded. This piece was commissioned specifically for the celebration, Mr. Collins said, his voice unusually tense. It's a rare honor, but it's also a challenge. We have 2 weeks to perfect it. Let's begin. From the first note, something felt wrong. The music didn't just sound eerie, it felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on us. My trumpet felt harder to play, as though the valves were sticking, but no amount of oiling fixed it. By the third rehearsal, things got stranger. Sam, our percussionist, said he kept hearing whispers when he struck the cymbals, faint murmurs that didn't stop until the rehearsal ended. Jess, our clarinetist, swore she saw movement in the reflection of her instrument, shadows that weren't ours. One day, midway through practice, the lights in the band room flickered, and a chilling wind swept through the room. Mr. Collins dismissed it as an electrical issue, but the way his hands trembled as he flipped through the score told me he didn't believe that. The town square was packed with people. Strings of lights hung from every building, and the old clock tower loomed above, its hands frozen at midnight, a tradition, they said, to honor the town's history. As we took our places on the stage, a strange fog rolled in, muffling the sounds of the crowd. When Mr. Collins raised his baton, a hush fell over the square. We began to play. The first few measures were fine, but as we moved into the main melody, the air seemed to thicken. The music echoed unnaturally, as if the notes were being swallowed and amplified by something unseen. Then it began. Shadows emerged from the fog, tall and twisted figures that moved unnaturally, like marionettes with tangled strings. The crowd gasped, some screaming, but most stood frozen, as if hypnotized. The music grew louder, though none of us were playing any harder. My trumpet burned hot in my hands, the valves moving on their own. Jess's clarinet emitted a wailing sound, not written in the score, and Sam's cymbals crashed in perfect rhythm without him lifting a hand. Mr. Collins tried to stop us, waving his arms frantically, but his movements slowed, as if he were moving through water. His face contorted in terror as he was dragged into the fog by the shadowy figures. The music reached a fever pitch, and I felt an invisible force pushing me to play harder. My lungs burned, my hands cramped, but I couldn't stop. The shadows swirled around the stage, their forms coalescing into something massive and ancient. When the final note rang out, the fog dissipated. The crowd was gone. The square was empty except for the band, now standing in silence. The clock tower chimed midnight, though its hands hadn't moved. Mr. Collins was never found, and the town forbade any mention of the Centennial or the celebration. But the music haunts me still. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the melody echoing through the air, a reminder of what we summoned that night. We should have never played at the Centennial Celebration. The silence after the performance was deafening. My hands were still gripping the trumpet, but it felt like a foreign object. Around me, my bandmates stood motionless, their instruments either dangling from their hands or lying abandoned on the stage. The square, once alive with townsfolk, was desolate. The only sound was the faint echo of the clock tower's chime, fading into the night. Mr. Collins was gone, dragged into the fog by those shadowy figures. My chest heaved as I tried to make sense of what had happened. "Where is everyone?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. No one answered. None of us knew. The fog began to recede, revealing more of the square, but what it revealed wasn't what we expected. The buildings looked wrong. The windows were dark, the walls weathered and cracked as though they hadn't been maintained for decades. The vibrant banners and lights from earlier had disappeared, replaced with tattered remnants swaying in an unseen breeze. "This isn't real," Sam muttered, his voice barely audible. "This has to be some kind of hallucination." But it was real. The cold air biting at my skin was real. The ominous silence was real. And the oppressive feeling, like we were being watched, was very real. "Let's get off the stage," I suggested, my voice shaking. The others nodded silently, and we climbed down, sticking close together. The streets were eerily empty, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following us. Every shadow seemed to shift when I looked away, every faint rustle made my heart pound. "We need to find Mr. Collins," Jess said, gripping her clarinet like a weapon. "He might know what's going on." "Did you see what happened to him?" Sam shot back, his voice rising. "He's gone. Just like everyone else." "Stop it," I snapped. "Fighting isn't going to help. Let's stick together and figure this out." We decided to head toward the clock tower, its looming presence seeming both ominous and significant. As we walked, we noticed something even stranger: there were no sounds of life. No crickets, no wind, no distant cars. Just the echo of our footsteps. When we reached the base of the tower, we saw the door slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges. A faint light flickered inside. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open, and we stepped into the dimly lit interior. The inside of the tower was unlike anything I had imagined. The walls were lined with ancient, weathered portraits of people who seemed eerily familiar. One by one, we realized why: they looked like older versions of the people from our town. Their expressions were grim, their eyes almost pleading. Beneath each portrait was a plaque with a name and a date, none more recent than 1923. "What is this?" Jess whispered, running her fingers over a plaque that read Elias Crowell, 1823 to 1923. "The founder," I said, my voice hollow. "But why does it stop at 1923? That doesn't make sense." As we moved further inside, we found a spiral staircase leading up to the tower's peak. The light we'd seen earlier seemed to come from above. With no better plan, we started climbing. The staircase creaked under our weight, each step echoing unnaturally. At the top, we found a massive, circular room filled with strange artifacts, old instruments, tattered sheet music, and a single podium in the center, holding a bound, leather tome. Sam approached the tome hesitantly, flipping it open. Its pages were filled with the same eerie, incomprehensible notations as the Centennial March. But near the end, there was an entry written in plain English. "To ensure the town's prosperity, a performance must be held every 100 years. The music binds them, appeases them. Should the ritual be disrupted, they will come to claim what is owed." "They," Sam muttered, backing away from the book. "This is some kind of deal?" "It's not just a deal," Jess said, pointing to another line further down the page. "The performers are the sacrifice." Before we could process what that meant, the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed below. Shadows pulled at the base of the staircase, and we realized they were rising, climbing toward us. Sam slammed the book shut, and the room was plunged into silence. But the silence was worse. It was alive, buzzing with unspoken malice. "We need to go," Jess cried, but the shadows reached us before we could move. The room shifted violently, and we were no longer in the clock tower. Instead, we found ourselves back on the stage in the square, but now we were surrounded by figures cloaked in darkness. They weren't fully human, too tall, too angular, with eyes that glowed faintly like embers. They stood silently, their presence suffocating. One stepped forward, holding a conductor's baton. It pointed to us and then to our instruments. The message was clear: play. "No," I said, shaking my head. "We're not doing this." The figure didn't speak, but the pressure in the air grew unbearable. My trumpet levitated from my hands, the valves moving on their own. Jess's clarinet emitted that haunting melody, though she wasn't playing. The music forced itself through us, our bodies mere puppets for whatever entity we'd awakened. As the music grew louder, the square began to collapse. Buildings crumbled, the clock tower shattered, and the ground split apart, revealing a swirling void beneath. I knew we couldn't keep playing, we had to end this. "Destroy the instruments," I shouted over the cacophony. Jess hesitated, but Sam grabbed a drumstick and smashed his snare drum. The sound cut out immediately, and one of the shadowy figures dissolved into ash. Realizing this was our only chance, we all turned on our instruments, breaking them one by one. Each time, the music weakened, and another figure disintegrated. The conductor snarled, its glowing eyes flaring, but it was powerless against us. Finally, I took my trumpet and hurled it into the void. The last note echoed and died, and the remaining figures vanished. The square was silent once more. When the fog lifted, the town was restored. People reappeared, going about their lives as if nothing had happened. But they didn't remember the Centennial Celebration, or us. It was as if we'd been erased from their reality. The band dissolved after that. None of us could bear to pick up an instrument again. Mr. Collins was never found, and the town forbade any mention of the Centennial. I moved away years later, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint music carried on the wind. A distorted melody, haunting and unfinished. We should have never played at the Centennial Celebration.